Hello. The name is Regis Kilbin, and the game is Hearthstone. And today we're going to be talking about a TGT budget beast druid deck. And TGT, if you're not quite familiar with Hearthstone just yet, stands for the Grand Tournament, the latest expansion in Hearthstone. And this deck includes a handful of new cards from that expansion, in fact. So this budget deck is for brand new players who don't have very many cards and don't have a lot of arcane dust yet to craft any new cards and need to assemble a competitive deck on a true budget. And with that in mind, this deck only requires 600 arcane dust to craft, which is just about as affordable as a truly competitive deck can get. Now, do keep in mind if you've been playing Hearthstone for a while, this deck won't be for you. You probably have some better cards and some more dust and can make a more refined and competitive list. But if you're brand new, this is the kind of deck that can introduce you to ranked play and maybe even help you climb as high as somewhere around rank 10 or so. So it can be really helpful for new players out there. The general strategy with the TGT budget Beast Druid deck, even though it's got the Beast moniker, this is still somewhat what they refer to as a ramp Druid deck, and a ramp Druid deck's goal is to use cards like Wild Growth and Innervate to ramp up your mana faster than normal, which allows you to play bigger minions quicker and gain a true value and board advantage in the mid to late game. So that's what this deck does, but it also does it with a few beasts, using the Beast Tribal affiliation for some fun synergies and some fun buffs along the way. So the goal with this deck is to survive early, ramp up your mana through the mid game, and then start dropping giant threat after giant threat. In other words, huge minion after huge minion that your opponent simply can't answer until you just overwhelm them with huge bodies and push for lethal damage. So in order to do that, in order to ramp up into those big 7 and 8 and 6 cost and 5 cost cards down here, we have to survive the early game against aggressive decks, even against mid-range decks that can swarm us if we're not careful. So to do that successfully, you have to mulligan well with this deck. Your opening hand and your first couple card draws are going to determine your success rate 99% of the time. So before we get into any cards, first we need to discuss the mulligan phase. In the mulligan phase, one card should be sought out far more than any other card, and that is your 2-mana Wild Growth, which allows you to gain an empty mana crystal. This is your primary ramp card. It costs you a little bit of tempo early, but it allows you to ramp into these minions so much more quickly, and is probably the most powerful card in this deck, and is certainly central to its success. So anytime you get Wild Growth in the mulligan, keep it. If you don't get Wild Growth, you probably need to dig pretty deeply for it. Against hyper-aggressive decks, Innervate is going to be your second best draw, because Innervate doesn't give you the long-term advantage that Wild Growth does, but it does give you a very short-term one-turn advantage in mana that can allow you to get something like a Druid of the Claw, or even a swipe out a turn or two sooner than normal, which can make a huge difference in staying alive. So focus on Wild Growth. Secondly, Innervate. Beyond that, there are a handful of early game cards that are still really good. First off is a new one from the Grand Tournament, and that is Living Roots. This allows you to clear some dangerous minions early if you have to, or more importantly, usually get 2 1/1 bodies onto the board. So you have to look for Living Roots. You also should keep an eye out for Wrath. It's hard to throw away a Wrath if you get one. Again, it kind of serves the same function as Living Roots, but also allows you to dig for some cards if you're not seeing what you need in your opening hand. And then finally, you need to keep an eye out for 2 minions in the mulligan phase, Druid of the Saber and Ironfur Grizzly. These can kind of just help you get onto the board and survive 1 or 2 turns extra until you really start dropping your threats. So basically, everything except Mark of the Wild, and even sometimes Mark of the Wild, is going to be good in the early game. If you have a card that's 4 or more mana in your opening hand, unless you see a pair of Innervates right next to it, you should throw it away. The only way you keep anything expensive is if you know you can ramp into it on turn 1 or 2 with an Innervate Wild Growth combo. Otherwise, throw away everything over 4 mana and pretty much keep everything 3 or less. That is going to get you off to a good start in this deck that will allow you to survive and thrive. So now that we're out of the mulligan, I think it's just easiest to go card by card and explain what each one of these cards does in this deck and the goal and the purpose that it serves. So starting out with Innervate, this is your 0 mana spell that allows you to gain 2 mana crystals this turn only. So if you have 2 mana and you cast Innervate, you jump up to 4 mana, allowing you to play something like a Wild Walker or a Swipe. So Innervate, it helps you keep up early. It can also allow you to make a really big swing turn, in the mid to late game. So you, for instance, if you have 8 mana, you could play a Druid of the Claw, followed up immediately by a Druid of the Fang for a 4/6 taunt and a 7/7 body on turn 8, which is pretty huge. So you could look for opportunities with Innervate like that to either swing the board or gain an advantage early. It's a very powerful card. It's not as good past turn 8 or 9 or 10. It's a lot harder to make it work. So if you draw it late, it can certainly be a dead card in your hand, but if you get it anytime earlier, it's gonna do some major work. And it's a free basic card, so it won't cost you anything to add to the deck. Up next is Living Roots. This is another spell that allows you to do one of two things. You can deal 2 damage to anything, minion or face, or you can summon 2 1/1 saplings. And Druids have trouble getting onto the board in the early game, so summoning 2 1/1 saplings on turn 1 can be a huge deal that allows you to combo with things like Mark of the Wild or even Wrath to help you clear early game minions like Knife Jugglers or shielded mini-bots or scary stuff that comes out on turn 2 or 3. Rarely will you be using this card as a removal spell that does 2 damage, but there will be times you need 2 damage and only have 1 mana to kill your opponent, and this card falls in your lap, and it's lethal. So keep an eye out for those opportunities. It can also just be good to straight up kill something or finish off a huge minion that just has 2 health. So it has a lot of utility for a 1 mana spell. Up next is Mark of the Wild, another free Druid card from the basic set. This gives a minion taunt and an additional 2 health and 2 attack in stats. So Mark of the Wild is not a card you see a ton in most Druid decks, but it is a free card and it's still a good card, and it combos with a few things in this deck really nicely. For instance, Living Roots, those 1/1s that you spawn on turn 1 can be buffed up by a turn 2 Mark of the Wild, and suddenly you've got a 3/3 and an extremely efficient mana cost on turn 2, which is fantastic. And not only that, but it has taunt, so it can even slow down enemy aggressive decks as well. So Mark of the Wild also combos with things like Druid of the Saber. When it has charge, it can suddenly become a 4/3 with charge, which is awfully good for 4 mana. It's like a Kor'kron Elite for warriors. It even works with other taunt minions just to give them a little bit of extra health to push enemies back. So Mark of the Wild has a lot of different uses and a lot of utilities. It's not always best if you have it on turn 2 and nothing else to do. So it relies a little bit on good luck and good timing, but when it hits in the right spots, it hits in major ways. We already discussed Wild Growth quite a bit, but just a refresher, Wild Growth is your ultimate mana ramp card, and that it allows you to gain a mana crystal permanently, which again allows you to drop all these threats earlier than you should ever be able to. The cool thing about Wild Growth, unlike Innervate, is that when you get Wild Growth in the late game, like turn 10, and you don't need any more mana, if you cast Wild Growth, it will give you a spell which allows you to draw a card. So it's like a 2 mana draw a card spell even in the late game. So it's not just one of those early game tempo cards. It has advantages early and late. Up next is Wrath. This is a common card for Druids, still cheap and affordable, and it's used in virtually every Druid deck, so you're still going to get value if you craft this card. It's a spell which allows you to do one of 2 things. You can just deal 3 damage straight up to an enemy minion, or 1 damage to an enemy minion and also draw a card. Now, our deck is a little bit light on card draw. We really only have Wrath and Starfire and potentially some Wild Growth draws in the late game. So I think you should bias yourself slightly with Wrath to draw a card more often than to deal 3 damage. Of course, it's just going to depend on the moment in the game and the opponent and the type of deck you're playing. You might have to do 3 damage in some situations to stay alive or kill an extremely vital minion. Other times, that 1 damage ping will be just enough, and you'll need to dig a little deeper for a card. So Wrath allows you to do either of those things, and it's powerful in both ways. Up next is Druid of the Saber. This is another new card from the Grand Tournament, and it's our first Beast card since we are calling this a budget Beast deck, and that's relevant as you'll see later on. Not quite yet. You'll understand the synergies once we get down the list, but this is our first Beast, so do keep that in mind. It's only a Beast once it has been transformed. You'll notice there's no Beast label there on it now, but once you transform it, I promise it will be a Beast in either form. And this card allows you to do one of two things. It can transform to gain charge, which is a 2/1 charge minion, which is pretty decent value for 2 mana. It's like a bluegill warrior? Blanking on the name, but the 2/1 charge Murloc. It can also gain 1/1 in stats and stealth, making it a 3/2 with stealth. Now, sometimes you'll need the charge just for the extra damage or a quick clear, so that's nice, but I like this card more because of the stealth. A 3/2 minion in stealth that's a beast kind of guarantees you some beast synergies later on. Like it's going to be difficult for your opponents to remove this card in stealth other than with an area of effect spell. So you can leave it on the board for a turn or two safely in most scenarios and use it to proc something like your Wild Walker, which suddenly makes it a 3/5 with stealth, which is awfully good, or a Druid of the Fang, which will turn into a huge body for you. So there are some advantages to just dropping it in stealth. Now, you might have to pull it out of stealth to attack or make an efficient trade, of course, but it's nice to have that option that you can just drop it there and park it for a turn or two while waiting to expose some future synergies. Because getting a turn 5 Druid of the Fang for 7/7, or even a turn 3 7/7 thanks to an Innervate and a Stealth Druid of the Saber on turn 2, those are the kind of plays that win you games instantly. If you get an unanswered 7/7 on turn 3, your opponent is doomed. You're going to win the game. There's nothing that they can do. So it's nice. Druid of the Saber is a pretty great little card, and it's cheap to craft as well since it's a common quality, and it really opens up the opportunity for this deck to exist in the first place. Up next is Ironfur Grizzly. This is definitely not a card you'll usually see in competitive decks, but it actually makes sense in this kind of budget beast druid. It is one of the only free basic beast cards that's really any good. It's a 3/3 with taunt, which isn't amazing, but it's just enough sometimes to slow down aggressive opponents, because you do have a few taunts that you're going to rely on to get yourself to the late game. It also has some beast synergies, so it can be followed up with a turn 4 Wild Walker, to make it a 3/7 with taunt, or a 3/6, excuse me, which is extremely annoying. It's just a handy little card, and it's totally free for all players, so it fits really, really well into this list. And you're not going to win games on the back of Ironfur Grizzly, but it will offer you just enough value to still be competitive. Up next is the 4-mana Swipe. This is an area of effect spell that does 4 damage to one target, either minion or face, and hits everything else for 1 damage. This is kind of your go-to clear removal spell. It's really good for cleaning up the board and trading efficiently and finding the math that works out to clear minions really well. It can also be used on the enemy's face for 4 burst damage or 8 if you happen to have 2 of them. So Swipe is just kind of a high value card. It's one of your only removal spells in this deck, since we don't have hard removal with something like Big Game Hunter or a Naturalize or even the new card Mulch. You're going to be relying on Swipe pretty heavily and hoping that you find it in the right moments. It's great against 1/1s as well, so if you run into Warlocks with a bunch of Imps, or if you run into Paladins with a bunch of Silverhand Recruits, Swipe is going to be carrying the load for you. It's also a free card, so that's always nice. Up next is really the first card in our deck that exposes some beast synergy, and that is Wild Walker, another new Grand Tournament card. This is a 4/4 for 4, which isn't awesome in its base stats. For instance, something like a Chillwind Yeti is 4/5 for 4, and that's just a basic free card. But this has a cool battle cry: give a friendly beast plus 3 health. And in my opinion, that 3 health battle cry is often worth far more than the 1 health that this minion would come with if it was just a standard card. And that's because the 3 health essentially gets charge. Since you're putting it on something that's already on the board, like an Ironfur Grizzly or a Druid of the Saber, you're enabling that 3 health immediately instead of passively. And it really works well in combination with taunt minions or charge minions for clearing for clearing enemies or just locking down on defense. Also, just the 4/4 body of Wildwalker itself is something that opponents can't ignore, and they have to find a way to deal with it. And it trades relatively well with early game minions like 3/4s that you'll or 2/4s that you'll see a lot of. So Wildwalker's a nice card, even if you have to play it naked. In other words, you don't get advantage from its battle cry. It's often worth the tempo just to play it on turn 4 as a 4/4. And the extra utility when it hits is really nice. Up next is an old school common Druid card, Druid of the Claw. Choose one charge or +2 health and taunt. So again, this is another minion that's not a beast right now, but once you transform it, it will become a beast. And you can use it as a 4/4 charging minion to hit opponents or to clear minions. But typically with this deck, you're probably going to need it to hold you over to turn 6, 7, and 8. So you're usually going to be playing it as the 4/6 taunt version, just because that sets up for Druid of the Fang so nicely. It can protect some higher value minions that don't have a lot of health, like Corehound, for instance. And you'll usually need it to slow down aggressive decks that are just kind of getting their steam built up in the mid game. This can be enough to just totally stop them as a 4/6 taunt that trades extremely favorably with a lot of different things. After that is Druid of the Fang. This is a 5 mana 4/4, which certainly is not exciting on its own regard. But if you do have a beast on the board, and we have a lot of beasts to proc this effect, you can transform this minion into a 7/7. So anytime you get this card off at turn 5 or earlier, it is absolutely nuts to get a 7/7 on turn 5. That's just a huge play and extremely difficult for opponents to deal with. They might have something like a big game hunter or other hard removal, and that's fine because we have so many more big minions that they could have used that on that we don't even care. If they use a big game hunter on a 5 mana card, that's a win for us. That's a good thing. That's a tempo advantage in the long run for us. So if you don't happen to have a beast on the board, Druid of the Fang can end up as a dead card in your hand that you'll have to wait to combo in one turn with Druid of the Saber or Ironfur Grizzly. In other words, you can kind of consider it an 8 mana 7/7 that carries a 3/3 body with it. I don't recommend playing Druid of the Fang naked as a 4/4 unless you absolutely have to and you're in a dire situation. You need a taunt with Mark of the Wild or something like that. Save it until you can play it well. You should have other cards in your hand you can play instead of it. But if you do get that 7/7 snake on the board, watch out. That's a ton of value. Up next is another removal spell and card draw mechanic, since we're a little light on both of those things in Druid decks in general. This is Starfire, a 6 mana, deal 5 damage, and draw a card. This deck can occasionally start to run out of steam in the mid game around turn 6 or 7. If you're playing a couple cards per turn or burning through a couple innervates, you're going to be low on cards, and really we don't have hardly any card draw. So this can be that mid-game lifesaver refuel that gives you one or two big threats to keep up. Oh, gives you one big threat to keep up and make sure your board doesn't start losing steam right when you need to start finishing off the opponent. So it also does 5 damage, which can be on an enemy minion and clear things like an Emperor Thaurissan that's played on turn 6, and you can follow it up with an instant clear. Or it can be used on the enemy phase too if you need to burn them down for that final little bit of lethal behind a taunt minion. So Starfire has a lot of utility, both as a burn spell and as a card draw mechanic. Up next is yet another new Grand Tournament card and one of the coolest beasts I think in the game, a Captured Jormungandr. This is a 5/9 beast, which makes it the statistical opposite of the 9/5 Corehound. So these cards are almost like brothers here. But a 5/9 stat alignment is far more favorable than the 9/5 of the Corehound because it's so much more difficult to kill this card at 9 health. And at 5 attack, things like Big Game Hunter just totally whiff on this thing. It's also a beast, so you can proc a couple of those synergies we discussed before. And it's one of the few really good, affordable cards in the game. So with budget decks, we can't just load up on legendaries. Druid has some fantastic legendary and epic cards, but if you're a new player, I understand those are difficult to get. But don't worry, Captured Jormonger can still change the game and impact the game in the late game in major ways, and it's only a common, which means it costs 40 dust to craft this thing. Now, admittedly, that's 40 dust. It's probably not going to be useful later on because this card won't be featured in a ton of high-end, highly refined decks. But in this kind of deck, it can do a ton of work. Captured Doormonger is a solid body. It's a beast. It's really difficult for opponents to answer. It does damage. It has everything you want in a 7-mana card. It's probably the best high-end, non-legendary, non-epic card in the game. High mana cost card. It's that good. On the other hand, we have Corehound, which is not as good. At 5 health, it's far easier to kill. But we do need beasts in this deck. And Corehound is one of the biggest ones. And is still a huge threat for opponents that they have to deal with. They simply cannot leave it alive. So you're going to either force trades, or force removal, or win the game. All three of those are pretty good. Now, admittedly, they might be able to kill it for 4 mana and it costs you 7, but the way you're ramping and the way you're loading up the board and dropping threat after threat after threat, hopefully you're going to land on Corehound near the end of the game. So they've already emptied all their removal spells, and Corehound absolutely gets to stick to the board. It's not the best turn 7 play, but it might be your best turn 15 or turn 20 play, if that makes sense. So don't hope for this card early, but do hope for it late. It can still be good. Plus, it's totally free, so you're not going to be wasting any dust on old Corehound here. And then finally, we have kind of the biggest body in this whole deck, and a nice thick taunt that virtually every opponent will have trouble dealing with, and that is Ironbark Protector. This is a basic Druid card, so it's totally free, and it's an 8/8 body for 8 mana. Now, similarly to Corehound and even Druid of the Fang, this can be removed pretty easily by things like Big Game Hunter, but since you have so many Big Game Hunter targets and so many huge bodies, you're just going to be dropping turn after turn after turn after turn. You're going to eventually start forcing trades and be able to combo with mana advantages and tempo advantages and body advantages to the point where you just overwhelm and swarm the board against opponents who aren't experienced or don't have highly refined, pro-level decks, which hopefully from ranks 25 to rank 15 and even rank 12 or 10, that's what you're seeing is opponents who don't have the best decks and don't have perfect decks. And these kind of cards will stick and do work. So Ironbark Protector is kind of just that big finisher that's like, oh my god, I killed his Druid of the Fang. I killed his Captured Jormonger. I killed his Corehound. He's got to be out of stuff. And then you drop Ironbark Protector and they just concede in absolute and utter frustration. So that is our 30 card list, all the way from 0 mana up to 8 mana. And here, I'll let you look at the curve one more time. You'll notice it's pretty heavy at the 2 mana slot and pretty heavy at the 7+ mana slots. Those 2 mana slots are mostly our ramp cards and survival cards in the early game, and then we have a whole bunch of big bodies along the way. So, if you play this deck well, you will get wins. It's good. I tested it out myself in the ladder, and I was beating rank 15, rank 14 opponents. They certainly weren't expecting these kinds of cards to show up, but that can give you an advantage sometimes that benefit a surprise. So I know as a new player myself, I always want to know, okay, that's a cool list. That's going to be fun. I'm going to play this. But as I start to get new cards, how can I upgrade the cards in this list? Like, what comes next? And I've prepared a few suggestions about cards that you should aim for if you want to refine this list and continue to make it better. But I want to make one note. This is not the best kind of Druid deck in the world. This is not going to take you all the way to Legend if you keep improving this deck one card at a time. Eventually, you're going to have to either switch to a full ramp deck or aim for kind of a combo or token Druid deck. That's not what this is. So keep in mind with these upgrades, don't commit too hard to following this path. Be willing to diverge out into other types of Druid if that's the class you want to play. But that said, let's just get into some upgrades I have here. One of the best Druid cards that you can add that just has tons of utility is the 4 mana Keeper of the Grove. This allows you to silence an enemy minion, or not just enemy minions, any minion, your own minions as well, or deal 2 damage to any opponent. So this is like just a great flexible utility card. You can ping something off with 2 health. You can silence through a taunt or a scary buffed minion. And at 4 mana, it has a solid little body that trades well into aggressive decks as well. It's a rare card, so it's not expensive, not too expensive. And the great thing is, Keeper of the Grove shows up in almost every Druid list, so you're going to get value returned if you do decide to craft this card. If you're going to swap out something in your deck for Keeper of the Grove, it's a little tough. I would probably be willing to risk an Iron for Grizzly, potentially a Mark of the Wild, maybe even one Wild Walker or a Core Hound. So just test it and see. If you're playing more aggressive decks, swap out a Core Hound. If you're playing slower decks, swap out an Iron for Grizzly, for instance. Another good recommendation for this deck, and one that would make it much better, in fact, because it unlocks even more beast synergy, is Savage Combatant, a 4 mana 5/4, and anytime you use your hero power with this card, it gives your hero +2 attack. So that means your Druid hero would be able to attack for 3 total damage anytime it uses its hero power with this card on the board, which is a huge deal. Being able to clear for 3 damage or hit the face for 3 damage really does add up and offers a lot of utility. So not only that, it is a beast, so it can proc some of this other stuff as well. Savage Combatant is a really good, strong card. It's better than Wild Walker, but I wouldn't necessarily replace Wild Walker. I'd slot Savage Combatant in again for an Iron for Grizzly or a Core Hound or a Mark of the Wild. One card that would be perfect for this deck, but is an epic, is Ancient of Lore. This is a 7 mana card that's 5/5 and allows you to either draw 2 cards or restore 5 health to your hero. The reason this would be so perfect is because our deck does not have much card draw, and Ancient of Lore is a nice expensive card that's easy to ramp into, that allows you to refill your hand with 2 new cards while still putting a solid body onto the board. This is kind of a core Druid card that's in virtually every deck list I've ever seen, and it's expensive to craft because it's an epic, but you will use it a lot, and it will make this deck far better. You can just rip out both Core Hounds and put Ancient of Lore right in their place, and your deck's going to be significantly better. One card to consider, but I don't actually recommend for this deck, is Knight of the Wild. This is another new Grand Tournament card, and anytime you drop a beast with this card in your hand, its mana cost gets reduced by 1. So it's kind of like got built-in mana ramping. The problem is that most of our beasts are mid to late game cards, so this mana cost is going to ramp down at a point in the game when we already have a lot of mana and we're already dropping big threats. In other words, we won't get this 6/6 out on turn 3. So it's not going to give us a huge early game advantage, and therefore doesn't really do much. But the final recommendation I have for this deck is that it wouldn't hurt to add the combo. If you're unfamiliar with the Druid combo, that is the 6 mana Force of Nature along with the 3 mana Savage Roar. This is an empty board combo that allows you to do 14 damage to the enemy hero instantly at any point that you have it. It's 9 mana total, and given that it does 14 damage, you can just straight up end games many times with the combo. Countless players have died to the combo at a moment's notice, and it would fit into this deck extremely well. It's great in ramp Druid decks. Unfortunately, Force of Nature is an epic card, so it's a little bit expensive to add. Thankfully, Savage Roar is free, so it's not going to be that bad. But I do recommend you add at least one copy of the combo. Again, I'd rip out the Core Hounds and add the combo straight in. That would make this deck even better. So that's it for the TGT budget Beast Druid deck. I think it's a lot of fun. It's something that you'll never see on the ladder. Nobody really is playing Beast Druids. So you're going to be both surprising your opponents, you're going to be super unique, and you're going to be having tons of fun along the way. And beyond that, it's still a pretty competitive deck that can help you climb the ranked ladder successfully. And as a new player, I know that's what most of us are wanting to do. So I hope you do enjoy the TGT Budget Beast Druid. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.